Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by Techstrong, AWS, and LaunchDarkly. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting presentation ahead, but first I have just a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. First, today's session is being recorded. So if you miss any of this webinar, or you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session. If you have any questions, we want you to send those in using the Q&A tab, which can be found on the right side of your screen. This is also where you're going to find the chat tab. That's where we want you to let us know your thoughts throughout today's webinar, or just let us know from where you're tuning in. And finally, before we close, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards before we close. I'll also point out in the handouts tab, there are a couple of resources there to help aid with today's webinar, so feel free to download those at your own leisure. So our topic today is accelerate and de-risk your AWS migration. And I'm joined by Cody DeArkland, Director of Developer Relations at LaunchDarkly, and Aliyah Abed, Director of Solutions at LaunchDarkly. Cody, Aliyah, thank you both so much for joining me today. I'm going to let you take it from here.
Thanks, Cody. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. As Cody said, I'm Aliyah. I'm on the Product and Solutions Marketing team here at LaunchDarkly. Been here for about 2 years. I work really closely with our customers and also with our AWS partner team. So we have a lot of conversations about migration and using LaunchDarkly with AWS. I'm super excited to chat with Cody today and inform you all about how to use LaunchDarkly for migrations. And I'll pass it over to Cody to introduce himself.
Hey everyone, my name, as we've already covered, is Cody. Also a little confusing because there's 2 of us now, so we're replicating, which is a scary thing. I do developer relations at LaunchDarkly, so I look after a team of about 5 people who are really responsible for how we talk about the technical story and what I call like the practitioner journey of delivering software with LaunchDarkly, and really just delivering software as a whole. So we do the fun demo stuff. We build external video content. You can see us at conferences where we talk about things from what is a DevOps, as well as like how to actually deliver software better, faster, stronger, all that good stuff. So we've got a fun one in store for you today. Just a couple of, for me, housekeeping things I like to say. If you see me look over to the left, it's because that's where the screen is that's monitoring how this is going. So I'm usually looking over there to see if there's Q&A coming in. So I'm not distracted. It's just me looking to make sure there's no questions coming through, because we want to make sure that this is engaging. We really built this to be a more interactive and conversational presentation. You guys get hammered with slides all the time. We want to make it a little bit more conversational and fun. We're going to have some really cool demos to go through in a little bit here. But I'm going to fire up sharing and get our slideware going. That's just a couple of quick slides to cover what we're doing and what we're talking about here. But we're going to get into some actual how it works fun here directly.
Thanks, Cody.
No problem.
So Cody's going to bring up, like he said, just a couple slides. Promise we won't bore you to death with slides today, but we want to just kind of set the foundation for what we're talking about. For those of you that are not familiar with feature management, first kind of tell you a little bit about what it is, so you have some context around what it means for cloud migrations. We will get into the weeds of cloud migrations with feature management. But first, for those who are not familiar with the concept, feature management was pioneered by LaunchDarkly. It's essentially a framework for managing feature flags at scale. If you don't know what a feature flag is, I'll tell you, and you might know it as something else, maybe feature toggles. So a feature flag is essentially an if statement that's wrapped around a piece of code. When it evaluates as true, the code is applied and the feature is turned on. This isn't a new concept. People have been using feature flags for years. But there are some limitations with this way of using feature flags. They typically only read Boolean values. They're hard to manage at scale, and usually they have to be managed by developers. So any changes to a feature requires development resources. So what feature management does is it gives teams a framework for using feature flags across teams, platforms, and use cases, which Cody will get into a little bit more next. But it really helps power DevOps at scale. And essentially a feature flag, what it does is it separates the deployment of code from its release. So without a feature flag, if you're deploying code to production, you're releasing it to all your users right then. And that can be really scary for teams. So with feature flags, an engineer or engineers can deploy their code on demand when it works for them. And then that code can be released to users later, either when it's production ready or it's gone through, all the testing it needs to go through, or when it makes the most sense for the business. And so what feature management does is it gives teams control over how and to whom features are released to users. So for example, you can release a feature to a small subset of users to test that it works before rolling it out to all your users. Or you can also target features to certain groups of users based on attributes. So that's the basics. If you have questions, we can definitely answer them later. That's the what. I'd love to pass it to Cody to talk a little bit about the how feature management works.
I like it. So I usually start with this very basic slide. We're used to this idea when we talk about feature flags and the way we roll out these changes, the way we roll out a feature flag. We're used to this idea of we have an application that our users or a group of people are using inside of our environment in some way. In LaunchDarkly, we create a feature flag, developer plugs that into the code, pushes that code up, turns that feature on, and the application changes in some way. And we'll talk a little bit more about the vagueness of some way later on. But the big thing here is we're used to this flow, right? This flow of feature flag is created, that feature flag controls the way something is experienced, and when it's turned on, it changes the application out. From a tech standpoint of how this works and why we're a little bit special in this space is we've built our environment and built our platform to be something that scales globally. So we have this thing called the Flag Delivery Network, and it's 100 plus CDN points of presence that allow your applications to connect back into it to evaluate those feature flags. Feature flags are used, as Leah mentioned, in a lot of different ways. Some people use them as just configuration entries to change based on an environment variable that's put in, or at build time, it renders the application a little bit different. The power of a feature flag in its technology is being more dynamic and more of a live experience. And that flag delivery network is a huge part of what makes that possible. And the uniqueness about us and kind of what we do in that space is that global reach aspect of it. So that if you're using an application, you're on your phone and you're hitting it in Australia and Sydney, you're going to have the same experience performance-wise as someone living in New York and hitting their application there. Those feature flags are going to resolve immediately because of the closeness to those points of presence. When those SDKs connect, they're pulling down those flags locally into the application and resolving them based on conditions that you've set up inside of the platform. You're going to see those live here in just a couple of seconds. We're going to jump in and actually start exploring that a little bit. But really wanted to set the foundation of how this works globally and why our approach to this is a little bit different. You can do this in code without all of this backend, but you're going to suffer performance-wise. It's going to be harder to have a consistent performance when that's all running in the server-side code. And on client-side code, it's even more challenging. When I say client-side, I mean things like JavaScript frameworks like React, as an example, that run more locally and on the user's device. So there's ways to do this. You're just not going to get the scale and the performance and the central management capability of doing it otherwise. So let's get a little bit better context. Let's actually play with this a little bit and show it live. I'm hoping that there are people here who will be able to take this for a spin with me. So this is an application I use. I do demos on this a lot. Aaliyah's seen this way too many times now. You'll see a QR code here in the top left. I like to make this interactive and fun so that we can all participate. So if you grab your phone, which I have mine here, and you launch your camera app, this works natively on iOS. I believe it works natively on Android now as well. But if you hold it up to that QR code, it'll actually let you launch the application on your phone, and you'll be able to follow along and see some of these changes as I move through the process inside of LaunchDarkly. So here's LaunchDarkly. We're in the platform here now, and we're looking around and exploring the actual platform a little bit. So this is the wrong project. So let me switch to the right one. That's a different demo that we're going to do later. Here we go. I'm going to clear off some of these that we can turn off so they're not present. I wouldn't quite call that a demo fail, but that was not what I intended things to start off with. There we go. Application looks a little bit different now. And if we pop back into it here, we can see it's a lot different in the actual UI. So what is a feature flag, right? We've talked a little bit about that in theory and concept. A feature flag is a feature in the platform. So the QR code that you viewed is a feature. I have this set up to only show on desktop devices. So mobile devices you connect, like your phone, won't see that. So when you're connecting to it right now, you're not seeing this mobile on your device. You're only seeing that if you're using like a desktop browser and going to Kodi LD demo. That's because we have a targeting rule in place within LaunchDarkly, which is this right here, that controls that visibility. Inside of the code itself, let me go ahead and launch that. Bring this up right now. There we go. Inside of the code for the application itself, we have these feature toggles that exist that control the visibility of that application. And this is without going super deep in how to read JavaScript and how to read code, this is an extremely important differentiator here, because when this flag evaluates as true, this code runs. When it's false, it does not run. What does that mean? That means that when there's problems with that component, or maybe it's incomplete or not fully functional yet, still in development, users who are not receiving that target don't actually receive that functionality yet. This lets you test in production, test live. This is the kind of foundation of where we start to build on some of these use cases we're going to talk in a little bit about here. Popping back into the demo real quick, just making a quick change before we jump back into the scheduled talk. If I go in and say I wanted to do something like change the header, right? We have our application here, and if you're watching on your phone, you should see this existing image. Words are hard. I'll go in, turn on production header. This is what we call a Boolean flag. So it's just a true or false statement. If I go in here and we look at the different types, it's true or false. That application is now changed and has this header here. When I talked earlier about the flag delivery network, me toggling that has pushed that change out to the global CDN and returned it down to your device. Your device actually has this rule already cached locally in it, so it's evaluating it immediately. So that flag value of being on versus off goes up and gets sent down to your device and re-renders the change itself locally. This is what we call kind of our 80% use case, in the sense of the most basic way you can use LaunchDarkly is to roll out these changes. We're going to talk more in this webinar about how that changes when you look at different ways that this could be rolled out, but you can roughly see how it works now. Other common use cases we see for this, we see, again, people rolling out changes into a web page. Maybe you want to roll out a different way to control how users log in. You want to change different aspects of functionality within the web page. This is all things that are common. People want to change aspects of APIs or services that communicate. Very common use cases that we address. A lot of times people ask, well, what's the flip side of this? It sounds like there's a lot of flexibility here. There totally is. There are definitely things you don't want to use a feature toggle for. I've had some people say, well, could I write an entire blog with this, right? Could I have my page render feature flags, and I just create a new feature flag for every blog that I write, and I plug a huge chunk of text in there? Could you? Sure. Probably shouldn't do that. It's not really a system designed for like content management in that way. There are definitely things you want to do more in configuration management systems to push down like true configuration values. But we definitely do that. You're going to see this later on in the demo, where I do push down things like database configurations via LaunchDarkly. That's because I want to be able to control who's consuming that. So a lot of it comes down to the use case that you're trying to satisfy and what you're trying to do. The biggest places I say stay away from times where you're making every single component of the page a feature flag. Over time, when you have 50 components on a page, that's going to slow down the performance. Just without feature flags, that size is going to start to slow things down. Then you start mixing in these evaluations on demand, and you can see a place where it gets a little challenging to manage. The configuration management one is a big one. You don't want to over rotate and put every config value into a feature flag. There are times where it makes sense. Just evaluate those kind of time by time. Going back to the theme of this webinar, though, migration, huge use case, really great use case for us. I know Aaliyah's done a ton of work in this space already and kind of building up this use case for us. So I want to let her talk a little bit about what's your view on migrations? What's some of the work that you've done to really kind of start to bring this use case up more?
Thanks, Kodi. That was awesome. I love to, no matter how many times I see that demo, I still enjoy it. So thank you. Yeah, so Cody talked about kind of just, the tech behind feature flags and feature management. Even if you have used feature flags or even a feature management platform, you're probably familiar with the common use cases, things like trunk-based development, testing in production, user targeting, experimentation. Those are all things LaunchDarkly talks a lot about. But like Cody said, this webinar is about cloud migrations, and that's a use case that we've been focusing a lot on. My team has been working a lot to understand what value users are really getting in different use cases beyond, our kind of standard, what you usually think of for feature management. So cloud migration is one that we've always known was possible. We haven't dug into it a ton in the past or really focused on it in our messaging, but we were starting to see more and more customers finding value in LaunchDarkly for migration projects. And even internally, our engineering team, we use LaunchDarkly for all the things at LaunchDarkly. And one of them was a database migration, which we'll get into. But essentially, the benefit of LaunchDarkly, I think at its core, is being able to make changes without impacting your users. So one example, we had two of our engineers speak at reInvent last year about migrations. They talked about a service or a streaming architecture migration that we did, and also the database migration. And they opened it with a really interesting analogy, which just stuck with me. And I'll share it here. I hope it sticks with you. But so Mike Zorn, I'll give him credit. He's on our engineering team. He's awesome. He talked about the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, which to LaunchDarkly is near and dear to us because our office is in Oakland. And I think it was in the 80s, the bridge had been damaged so much that it couldn't be repaired anymore. It needed to be replaced. So they started to build a new bridge. Took 11 years. My goodness. Glad I'm not in that business. But it took a while. And when they were finally able to introduce the new bridge to traffic, they didn't have a gradual way to get cars from the old bridge to the new bridge. They needed to ensure that the new bridge was safe, obviously. And so what they had to do was actually shut down the bridge for 5 days to all traffic. So Bay Bridge was closed. And that's how they were able to test and validate before opening the new bridge and shutting down the old one. So then he posed a question to the audience, which was, when was the last time you shut down your critical infrastructure for 5 days? So I'll pose that here. I hope you can't remember the last time that happened, because it never has. But the point was that, in the cloud era and the time that we're all working in, engineers really can't afford to have downtime because of changes. You can't take a critical application down for users for that long. Even maintenance windows are, not something that many companies are able to do. So I thought that was a great way to kind of frame the problem that we face when we're trying to switch backend components in an application. In most cases, people need to keep their app running while they're replacing a database, while they're switching services and changing out backend components without their users even noticing. So that's where LaunchDarkly's value really shines for migrations and for feature releases. I think it spans across. We'll talk a little bit about that. But in addition to that, so we need to do it without users noticing. That's, yes, difficult to do, easy to say. So what LaunchDarkly does is that we help teams gradually make changes to their application. So gradually introducing a new backend component while keeping the old one running and moving users in small increments. And then what you can do is, if you notice that there's a performance impact, we also connect to monitoring tools so that teams can move users and look at how those changes are impacting their application's performance. You can use a kill switch and route users back to the original system in the event of any error. So you're not going to take your application down because of a migration. So, this concept spans across front and back end changes, but really it's these small gradual changes just make changes less risky overall. And the ability to validate performance along the way. So that's the crux of what we hear customers getting out of these migration projects with LaunchDarkly. And they typically seem to fall into kind of two categories. We've got like the legacy cloud migrations, people who are moving from their data centers to the cloud, or they're moving some workloads because they're going to keep some in the data center, or they're moving from one cloud provider to another because of either a change in strategy or the desire to go multi-cloud. And then the other and I would say more common and more continuous migration process that we see is this concept of refactoring. So your app's in the cloud, but you need to continuously optimize different components of it to really take advantage of the efficiency and benefits of the cloud. So we'll talk a little bit more about different examples and customers who have kind of been through it and shared their stories with us. But first, I want to pass it over to Cody to talk a little bit more about this concept of thinking about a front-end feature and feature management for making user-facing changes to bringing that concept to the back end. And Cody, you wrote a really interesting blog about this, and it'd be great to just kind of give us a little snippet of that here.
Oh, totally. Stepping back real quick though, I think a lot about when I would roll out changes to environments, in like especially production environments, but even I worked in a very highly regulated like nuclear energy company, so it's like every change was a very big deal for me. Like when I was in, well, not every change, but most changes were big deal changes, and I think about the ways I would make this work without LaunchDarkly were really challenging to like orchestrate around. Like oftentimes I'd bring up a second copy of my application and I'd have my network team set 10% of my traffic on the load balancer to go to the new service. The challenge with that, you highlighted this a little bit, it's worth emphasizing, is once I did that 10% of users, one, it was really challenging to control who that 10% was. There were times where I'd want the random 10%, but more often than not, I'd want a team at a time. I'd want to say, this group, the West Coast users. I want the West Coast users to use the new West Coast database from 2 a.m. to 7 a.m. That was a tough one to do in the system. Like there was ways it could be done, but it was really hard to do with like traditional network tech in the sense of splitting traffic or something else. And when I could do it, the end result was that everybody inside of that, like everybody that was hitting that new application was getting all of those new changes. And so it became really hard to like handcraft this separate environment with one specific change as opposed to all of the changes, and then batch those all together and do it all again for the full version of the app. And I think it's worth repeating that what LaunchDarkly shines at is giving you the ability to do these migrations or these changes in a gradual way. What if, using the Bay Bridge example, what if they could have said, hey, we're going to let every car that's under this weight limit cross the bridge first and see how it is, or even earlier than that, we're going to let 2 cars an hour go through and just to validate. And then we're going to start saying everybody whose car is under X amount of weight, or every Honda Civic can drive across the bridge, but we're going to hold off here. The management of making that happen manually is extremely hard. The same way it is in software. Like I only want West Coast users to hit during this window is a hard thing to accomplish. And I just think it's the thing that got me the most excited for working with the tool myself when I was a customer using it, was the ability to get really granular in the way that we roll these changes out. And it kind of bridges into the whole what is a feature thing. Like I wrote this blog post on the news stack around this concept of like, well, what is a feature? Because we're really used to features in an app being something that a consumer uses, right? Somebody buys your software, buys your tool, and uses a thing in it, and that thing is the feature. But anyone who works in the enterprise knows that a feature is a very vague term in reality, because ultimately migration to the cloud, for somebody, that is a feature, right? For a stakeholder who's engaged and cares about the platform and cares about the migration of that to the new environment, them running in AWS now is a feature. It unlocks a ton of new capabilities, a ton of new integration options, a ton of ways that their service can change. And so like a feature really is the thing that people are consuming. Feature isn't always used by your customer. If you've implemented password management in your application, that's a feature for the security team. The security team sees that, your consumers never see it. But these are all things that can be rolled out using LaunchDarkly and built on using LaunchDarkly. So I would challenge the people on this call, like when you're thinking about what a feature is, think about it in that broader sense. Moving to a new version of your API is definitely a new feature. It might be just rolling out a new software package, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, right? It might be moving off of a traditional Python API backend running on, an Nginx web server and moving into Amazon Lambda, right? And doing this as a function as a service framework instead, or using like an Amazon API gateway or something like that. That migration in itself is a feature, and that ability to move and say, today I'm going to have my dev team use the RDS instance for the database instead. I'm going to have the dev team use it, and we're going to do performance testing for them. I'm going to use LaunchDarkly to build a workflow that gradually increases this beyond just the dev team. I'm going to have it go to the QA team, and then I'm going to have it go to the West Coast users because I've configured a custom property in LaunchDarkly to say, West Coast users get this. I've configured a new web optimized version of the page, and I want that to go to mobile devices only. These are all changes that are really low friction to make in the platform. And you have the ability to spread that ability to disable that out to other teams also. So like SREs can go and disable it when they get 100 calls into the help desk if there's a problem. So I just think it's important to look at technology like this in the scope that it can impact and the ways it can impact the way that you release changes into an environment. And the scale just grows so much when you use something like LaunchDarkly. But that was a big rant on a topic, and I think I hit the evolution of a feature thing in there somewhere. I might have blacked out, so I might have forgotten it. But I think we wanted to dive in now and go a little bit further in the demo and show a little bit more. Probably a good time to take a look at questions as I get this rolling and see if anybody has anything to pitch my way while I get the demo spinning up. But yeah.
Cody, can you talk? There are a couple questions, but I think there's some we should save for later because they're not specific to this section. Can you talk a little bit more about the targeting rules and just the level of granularity, how users can set those targeting rules based on kind of like their business rules or needs?
Totally. So I'm going to do this more visual. So we're going to sidestep the existing demo and be a little bit more visual in this side of it. I have this demo I do for what we call Tech Talks. Tech Talks are something that we run to just teach different people about aspects of LaunchDarkly. So this is the demo I use. I shared this in the chat a little bit ago. So we're going to be using techtalk.launchdarklydemos.com. So if you can hit this QR code once again to access this application, or if the QR code is wonky for you, you can hit this from the chat. It's just http://techtalk.launchdarklydemos.com. And there's a lot of stuff that happens inside this demo. It's a very progressive demo that does a bunch of stuff. But before I get into your question, just want to set the stage. This is running as an overall platform in Amazon EKS. So this is a Kubernetes cluster that's running a front end, an API tier, and a local database. It's like a Postgres container. And part of the demo, we moved to Amazon RDS, and we're going to show that use case in a little bit here. But a lot of times, this is a real change that happens. People move from traditional databases onto RDS, and they want to be able to do that based on certain conditions. So if I come in here and I look at this database config rule, I have no rules applied. This is just a traditional true or false rule. But if I go in and I look at my users that are using the application, we can see a few people coming in. I appreciate that. We can see that I've configured a couple of specific attributes onto these users. In this case, I've configured simple ones like the device they're coming in from, so a browser, and then what operating system, so Mac OS in this case. This would be very easy to expand out to include business logic, to your point, Aaliyah, right? I could be pulling from the registration form and pulling in the user's registered time zone, where their local office is, what floor they sit on, what team they represent, maybe the product managers, maybe they're the dev team, the QA testing team, right? All of these can be attributes that then we can build targeting rules off of. So when I come back over to this feature flag option here, make this a little bit bigger because I think it's pretty small right now. When I go back into this database config, I can start using these target rules or the targeting capabilities to push these at people. So I can come in and say, add the Amazon RDS config to Cody, right? So Cody's in here. And now when Cody logs in, I put in my ID and hit submit, I'm going to receive this feature flag as true. But by default, everybody else is going to receive the local database, right? That's a very specific target. That is saying, I want to send to an individual. That doesn't scale very well, and just full transparency, because I could say, if it's me and Aaliyah on a team testing this out, I could add her in here, and now we can validate while everyone else is disabled. That's great. But when we want to start to impact scale and be a little bit more dynamic, the rules themselves start to really shine. So if I close that out and we go down and we can do add rules, there's a ton of attributes that we can start to build off of. Country, as an example, device type, as I mentioned before, email, first name, right? I can do silly things like first name starts with the letter C. So now everybody whose first name attribute starts with C gets this change, and I can specify what change it is. What's really interesting is we can combine these rules with a percentage rollout. So I could say all users whose first name starts with C, 50% of those users get the new database, right? I could say 50% of West Coast users or PST time zone users get this change, while the other 50% continue to get the existing local database. So this is where we start bringing in that business logic. It starts to combine when we use something called segments. I'm not going to dive too deep on this, but segments let us group larger pools of users. So I could potentially come into segments, create a segment specifically for West Coast users, and have it dynamically grab all West Coast users with that ID or with a West Coast attribute and group them into a segment. So it's just a logical grouping mechanism.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, we see, I mean, as you all can see, there are a lot of bells and whistles to the LaunchDarkly platform. But one thing we see a lot, or I see a lot in talking to customers and talking to them about why they came to LaunchDarkly in the first place, most of them are already using some sort of mechanism for turning features on and off, like we talked about before. But the ability to integrate business logic into that is where they suffer with the homegrown or config-based methods. So I think that's a really important call out. Is this really allows you to release in the way that you need to for the business, and it's very flexible. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, we're gonna show a little bit more now, which is gonna be fun. So here's our application. We can see the example here. I just talked through that. Again, I showed this in the other demo, but if I go in and I just do something simple like turn on a logon UI, that logon UI now shows up. If you're hitting this from your phone, you're seeing a logon screen now. Now I can come in here and I can type in Cody, like I said before, and hit submit. And what ends up happening is it creates a user in the background for me. So it grabs my identity here and says, okay, Cody is logged in now. And that becomes a registered user in the platform. Registered is a loose term. It just more so logs the user in. It takes a few for the users list to update. So it might be there now, might not. It might take a few minutes for it to actually pop all the way up. But now I can start to do that targeting I talked about off of my individual user. So like this flag here will turn on a new view to the UI. So what I'll do is I'll add a user target in here, and I'll go ahead and say, for Cody, I want to turn this on. For everybody else, I want the UI, the log or the API visibility UI turned off. So I'll save this, save the change. And when I go back in, we can see that's showing up now. If I clear my user, it goes away. If I came in and said, my name is Jane, you can see I'm not getting that anymore. But once again, if I type in Cody and hit submit, we can see that component now loads. Super important technical differentiator here. Say there was a problem here, like in the background, this is making an active API call. This is actively sending out a message to my local database and saying, hey, are you there? Are you working? Is everything good? If there was a problem with that connection, traditional framework, when it fired off that API call, maybe I coded it wrong. I wrote something wrong. I had a bad return in there. I was expecting to return a JSON object and I didn't return it right. Oftentimes that would crash the app. Like you get the React error where it's like a fades out the back screen and has an error of or code of the error in front of you, and you have to close it and reload. And then as long as you don't go that same path again, you're fine. But until you get to that, once you get to that, it crashes again. When you're not in the targeting rule for this, that code is never executed by your browser locally. It's there, but it's not being executed. So when we talk about testing in production and we talk about rolling out these migration changes, when things go wrong, if the user is not in the targeting group, they're not experiencing it. If they are in the targeting group, it's as easy as either changing the targeting group to remove that user or just disabling the feature entirely, and it's gone within 200 milliseconds. So it disables completely within 200 milliseconds. The important thing, again, is just if you're not in that targeting group, you're not getting the change, so you're not experiencing the problem. Why do we test at all? right? Like as the most foundational concept, why do we run test environments? Because we don't want to break it for people who are actively using the system. We don't want bad things to happen to people who are trying to get things done. And if you have an easy way to avoid those bad things happening to people you don't want impacted, can't think of a reason why you wouldn't use that. So we have this, it's up and running now. If I click on this, we can see I'm returning some silly data. It's just really a couple names in a database, but that's an actual API call that's happening in the background right now. And this is where things start to get fun. So if we go back into the feature flags now, and we look at this database config feature flag, this is the database migration use case. We're going to talk about that in a few here, but this is what that use case is. So if I go in and I look at the feature flag as it stands today, it's off, which means no one's being targeted with it. So it's currently serving the local database. If I turn it on, it's going to serve the Amazon RDS database. If I go into variations, we can see the different configurations that are coming down for this. So this is what we call a JSON flag. So this is pushing down database configuration details. There's more secure ways to do this. There's better ways to do this. This is a demo, so there's a little bit of flash here in the sense of just doing it in a way that's really visual. There's better ways to configure this with like more security-minded approaches. Again, don't take it too literal. It's a demo. But variation 1 is the Amazon RDS one with the new database configuration details. Here's the existing ones that relates to the database that's living within my Amazon Kubernetes cluster today. So when I switch back here, I'm going to bring this up and I'm going to have the database results here. We can see down in the bottom connected to local database. Now, if I go in here and I set the targeting rule to Cody once again and turn it on, and we switch back very quickly, we saw it switch really fast there. So we can see it's now connected to RDS instead, and it's getting a new set of data with the new schema and everything. So this is really important because a lot of times when you move to a new database, you're not just moving, and we'll talk about this more later, we're not just moving to just a new connection string, we're changing the structure of data too. So I'm getting a new structure back, which is great. But if I go in and clear this user out, that goes away. Now, if I type in Jane, I don't see the API at all. If I go in and type in Cody again, I get that back and it's RDS. What if I'm happy with the API view? I want everyone to see that now. I can go back in, hit that API visibility one, take Cody out of that view and set the new default to be UI visible. And now everyone who hits the application is able to see that API view, regardless of if they're logged in or not. All right, so the user's cleared. We'll refresh. It's connected right now to the RDS. I have that set up as the default. If you think about this in relation to how this would work in real environments, every time you did this change in production would be a new rollout of the software. It'd be a new instance you stood up and a new switch to point at the new application. You'd have to wait for the deployment time. There'd be the pacing of, is it up and running? There'd be a testing process. This is all happening within the running live application. Every time I turn one of these on or off, it's happening live across everybody who's connected. So you can start to see like the exponential time savings that happens when you're not having to redevelop this, reship it every time. You still have to push code, it still has to be deployed out, it still has to land, but you can control the rollout of these capabilities as you go. So again, popping back into here, Cody, if I switch this to the default is local database, but Cody gets the targeting rule, we'll save it. No one's logged in right now. I'm using the anonymous user. It's hitting local. If I go in and do like Jane or Tom, all of those are still receiving the local database. But the second I type in Cody and hit login, it'll switch over in a few moments here. Yep. And that's how we would handle things like a database migration in reality, right? Being able to gradually roll that out. In this case, I did it with one user and in mass, but we can do this in a programmatic approach too, gradually using like workflows or progressive rollouts where we say every day increase the amount of people who are getting this change by 10% and keep going until it's at 100%. But then again, when there's problems, right? If all of a sudden I think that this component's not working the way I want it to, if I go in and just disable that, that change will remove it from the running state anyways, so we can go back and pull it out when there's a problem.
And we can even automate that piece of it, right? Going even a step further to set a performance threshold, and if we exceed that in our APM tool, then it automatically turns the flag off.
Absolutely. It's a great call out, because like we have integrations, obviously, right? So I'm not going to dive into all of these, but it's a good thing to highlight. We have this integration section where we can see all of the different platforms that we can tie into. So to Aaliyah's point, we have integrations with like Datadog, Dynatrace, and these platforms. We can use them to track performance metrics and have that or activate features, disable features based on certain thresholds. So if you're using Datadog and you see 200 errors a second hitting the second you turn on your logon field, that feature is just broken. There's something wrong there. So you can have Datadog say, hey, if I see 200 events a second on this, call this flag trigger and turn it off, and it'll reach out and disable it. So you can start to have the system start to manage itself to a certain extent, and start to be able to control when things are being shut off or on. So that's a great call out.
Awesome.
So like I've obviously shown it's a fun demo. It's cool. It satisfies the use case, but I know that you tend to work with more of like the larger customer, more focused situations than I do usually. What are some things you're seeing, like trends you're seeing with those customers as they start to do like the whole cloud migration side of this? In this one, I showed the idea of moving from a database locally that might be in cloud. Like, what have you seen in the space?
Yeah, great question. And it's great to see it and then kind of zoom out and look at contextually how we're seeing this in the market. So like I said, we work with customers across a broad spectrum of cloud maturity, companies that were born in the cloud native, everything's cloud, or have migrated everything to the cloud. And then we work with, larger companies who are slower to move, and there's more risk associated with the potential of an outage associated with the migration, or the idea of re-architecting an application just being so complex and time consuming that orgs just can't even do it. They just want to get to the cloud. So with those companies, and first I'll talk a little bit about kind of the more legacy migrations, and then we can jump over to the replatforming and database and component migrations. But so with these large companies, and I'll give an example, we work with a healthcare insurance provider. They're Fortune 50 company. They're huge. And they're on their third iteration of cloud migration because of two prior failed approaches. And what do we mean by failed? So they're a great example of a company who they knew they needed to get to the cloud. They realized the benefits, but they didn't have a way to move their applications gradually. They didn't have the luxury of replatforming or re-architecting their application before moving it to the cloud because of the resources and the risk that could be associated with that. So they lifted and shifted, which I'm sure many of you have either done or heard of. That's moving your application from your data center to the cloud, kind of as is. And it really, really limits companies' abilities to truly leverage the benefits of the cloud. So with this company, they did that. Then they realized that they still weren't getting the efficiency and agility that they wanted out of cloud. So they rethought their process. They brought in a new, I think, CTO and leader, and then they kind of had a new approach. So now that we're on their V3 of cloud, and they had already been using LaunchDarkly, and back to Cody's point, actually, just taking one little step back. So we talked about how, you can apply the concept of launching a feature or apply the concept of a feature, a front-end feature, to these back-end changes. We're finding that a lot of these companies who have been using LaunchDarkly for cloud migrations for a while, they already used LaunchDarkly for rolling out new features. So they were comfortable with the concept of, gradual migrations. They saw the benefits of LaunchDarkly when it came to rolling out front-end features. And so it was a really natural progression for some of these companies to then apply that concept to things like database migration. So this customer, for example, had been using LaunchDarkly as part of their larger digital transformation and realized that they could use LaunchDarkly for their cloud migration. So they started to re-architect their application to microservices so that they could really be agile and leverage cloud the way that they wanted to, and use LaunchDarkly to gradually move traffic to those new services and test it. And so just like, everything we've been talking about. So they were able to, I would say, migrate more strategically. So that's one example and one kind of bucket, I would say, of our customers. These are healthcare, financial services companies who were slower to adopt cloud, but realize now that they need to get there. And they're, bringing LaunchDarkly into that strategy to do it the right way. After many times doing it the wrong way, I will say, maybe controversially. But that's definitely a big trend, is like lift and shift, trying to recover from that. The other kind of or I guess this isn't really a challenge, but another example that I'll give, and this was just kind of a straight migration first time kind of project from a company who was already using LaunchDarkly. So TrueCar, they're a large automotive marketplace. Maybe you've heard of them. So they have their own website, but they also manage 500 affiliate sites. Their product and engineering teams manage all of those sites. So they were going through a large digital transformation project several years ago. And as part of that, you'll hear some trends here, they were using LaunchDarkly to improve their release processes and development process to be quicker and more agile. Then they needed to move, as part of that project, all of those websites from their data centers to AWS. And they needed to do so, just like we've talked about, without impacting customers, without taking down any of these sites, and in a way that they were not impacting performance either. So they used LaunchDarkly as well to gradually move these websites, and they were actually able to give the product managers control of the move so that they could shift when they needed to, when it made sense for the business and their timeline. So that was a really interesting use case to me around both being able to kind of three different realms of LaunchDarkly, right? It's like the release process, the migration, and then delegating those releases or exposure of new infrastructure to users, and to people within the business who are not developers, which they wouldn't have been able to do without LaunchDarkly.
I think it's super interesting to me because LaunchDarkly, it starts off often as like a developer-centric tool. I mean, it is a developer-centric tool at the end of the day, but it starts off as this tool that the developer uses to just make it easier to roll out changes and control them in an application. But I think that much like what happens very often very much happens in like enterprises a lot, developers are responsible for getting the application launched. They do whatever they can to get there. So they bring these tools on, they start migrating to cloud, they swipe their credit card to get their services in cloud, and then all of a sudden they bootstrapped this process of moving to a thing. But really, the developer wants to code. The developer wants to build and ship code and get onto the next PR, the next pull, the next feature they're building. And so like as these organizations mature, they start to share the access to like something like other tools that have the same story or same general path, not in the feature management space like we do, but you see this with those observability platforms, right? People will start off with access to like a honeycomb, and we're talking about them a little bit later, but like those will start with dev teams and then gradually make their way to like SRE teams and then gradually make their way to product teams who are watching it. And like we follow a similar journey in that once developers have established it, they get the process in, they're happy with it, they start kicking off the access to parts of LaunchDarkly. Like product managers will own rolling out and changing the targeting rules. Developers most commonly don't know the team that is supposed to be consuming the feature. They're building it as part of a request or as part of a need they have, but they're oftentimes not the one to call the shot of saying, hey, the new logon is ready, I'm going to roll this out to all users now. Usually it's a product team. So like product teams will say, hey, I'll manage the rollout strategy or I'll manage the targeting rules. And so like now it becomes like that feature management gets democratized to the product team as well. And then you start to say, well, now you have these people managing the feature rollout. Who's going to manage when it's on or off if there's a problem? So it gets democratized out to the SREs and the help desk. I just think it's such an interesting way that like mature organizations end up rolling this out to other teams to own different components of it. So builders build faster, people release faster, people recover faster when there's problems. I think it's super, super interesting.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, even in my 2 years here, I've seen kind of an evolution of the groups that we talk to and how we grow within accounts, where the development team brings us in because they've learned about us somewhere or you've used us somewhere else. And then eventually we start talking to the product team. And recently we've been working with a lot of platform teams who are trying to scale across large orgs. I think product and platform teams could be 2 separate webinars themselves. So we'll stick to the migration since time is just flying. But yeah, I think it's great to see kind of the democratization and just the growth of LaunchDarkly within our customers. So quickly, I will also now cover a couple examples of replatforming. So this is something that we've seen, and as I was starting to kind of understand what are our customers, what the heck is LaunchDarkly for cloud? Where does it come into play? I started coming across all these use cases that were just very specific. A customer upgrading their geolocation service or upgrading their e-commerce platform. And that's kind of how this whole concept, and Cody, you and I worked together on this late last year of like, wait, this is kind of the same process as releasing a feature. It's just on the back end. So we call this continuous modernization. It's part of an organization's cloud strategy, but it's not necessarily the big migration. You're not lifting and shifting. It could be a huge project if you're re-architecting your entire app from a monolith to microservices, for example. That's no small feat. But what I find really interesting, and I'll give 2 examples, are customers who are optimizing. They're already in the cloud and they see an opportunity to adopt a new piece of technology to help optimize costs, optimize performance, help their teams work more efficiently. So I think that that's something that all companies need to do. And when we talk about cloud migrations, it may sound very like legacy or I'm already in cloud, but you'll never stop. Your technology stack will forever need to be optimized. So one example of this is a company we work very closely with called KnowBe4. They're in the security training space. They're huge advocates of LaunchDarkly and sometimes use us for use cases that they teach me things all the time about how to use the platform. But recently, and this is a talk we submitted with them for AWS reInvent this year. So I hope it gets accepted and we can share it with you all. But recently they noticed performance dips in their SCIM service. So they offer a product to their customers, and SCIM is basically provides functionality for user provisioning. And KnowBe4 said that this is one of their most important features for their enterprise clients. So seeing performance dip below their SLOs was concerning. And they started looking into the issue. Why was there performance issues? There was even an outage. There was a little bit of panic on the team. And after looking into it, they realized that their data model was using excessive memory and it was triggering outages. It was triggering the system to shut down. And they did some investigating. They actually used LaunchDarkly to kind of meter, to route traffic in a different way so that the memory usage was kind of, they called this a Band-Aid. So they used LaunchDarkly to route some of the traffic differently. And there's the whole blog post on this, which I'll share. It's very in-depth and talks about a lot of different technologies. But essentially, they had an issue. They used LaunchDarkly as a Band-Aid as they investigated and fixed the issue. They ultimately decided that they needed to rewrite their whole service because it just wasn't compatible. They were using Golang, and it wasn't, the way that memory was working was not efficient. And they also realized that it was very cost inefficient. So they rewrote it in Rust, and they work really closely with AWS. And they used an event-driven serverless approach with Lambda. So essentially rebuilt their service, kept the other service up and running because, again, they didn't want to take the feature away from all of their customers. And then they used LaunchDarkly to gradually roll accounts and users to the new SCIM service. So it sounds like a very nuanced project, but this is the kind of stuff that comes up with our customers all the time.
It's a framework thing, right? Like, I think that's what's interesting about it is that, like, yeah, it's very specific to them. That specific path is very specific to them, but the mechanism of I build a feature, I'm identifying that a feature is not like, no one's using them more because they're in Lambda now. They're getting better performance now as a result. They're having better management from an operational standpoint. Their cost is more controlled. Like, there's a lot of great things for Lambda, but like, a customer like me coming in and using their thing. It's not like, oh, this is on Lambda now, it's so much greater. Like that, no one's saying that, but they built this framework of we want to test, we want to move to a thing, we want to test a thing against people, we want to control who's experiencing that and not turn off old thing yet. And that use case is repeatable across so many different customers we have and so many like projects that they might run. So like they might be nuanced in the details, but everybody's nuanced in their details. That framework is the thing that's consistent and usable and repeatable across like any sort of change you're making.
Exactly. And I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I won't go too deep into the next example, but I think it's important to call out that you can also apply this framework to making the right business decisions as to how to adopt a feature or how to balance traffic between two different services based on how it performs and what it costs for you. So Honeycomb is a really good example of this. I will find a link and share it here to a talk that they did about Graviton2, testing it versus their Intel-based processor. And they ended up using kind of a split model where they pushed some traffic to Graviton2 and they kept their other processor for some traffic because that was the balance that worked for their business model.
And that's that one's a really cool one, and I'll ramble all day on this one because I think it's super cool. Like that whole space of like the Graviton instances, as an example, is a large technology shift. So there's definitely a lot of like, I don't want to say fear, but like, oh, I want to make sure that this all checks out the way that we think it's going to. And so like the ability to just test that is great. The ability to say, nope, didn't work out the way we thought it was, and just turn the feature off and return back to business as usual is amazing. The ability to say, this is working fantastically, let's now move this from 10% to 50% and just really hit it hard and see what happens. And like that can all be done by one individual making these adjustments in the platform and submitting them. Like the scale of that impact just blows my mind. Like the idea of somebody being able to control that across 100,000 users on a platform is just incredibly cool. So right. I think I'll ramble all day. So
yeah, well, that's actually another talk we submitted for reInvent. So hopefully everyone can hear more about both of those use cases. We've got a couple minutes left. We've given you a lot of information. I hope it's digestible. If not, you can watch the recording, but we do have some questions. So want to make sure that we're making this as valuable as possible and answering the audience's questions. So Cody, I think most of these are going to be for you. I will just ask them if you're good with that.
4 minutes, let's do it.
All right. So someone asked, what would the user experience be if someone is in the middle of using a feature and the feature was toggled off?
Yeah, so there's two ways you can answer this, good and bad, right? The good thing is it's off immediately. So whatever their component they're in or thing they're experiencing immediately goes away. Now there's a negative impact to that at times, right? If they're in a component, like actively using a web form, or they're actively calling an API and then that toggle gets turned off, it's going to turn off. So like that form might completely disappear. That API might suddenly revert back to the previous API. So it is going to be a very sudden change. Most frameworks hot reload that, like we have that kind of built in for the most part. So meaning they don't need to refresh their browser. It just happens. There are a couple of the frameworks that do need a refresh, but generally that'll be processed immediately and that change will just go away, whatever that is. It changes a lot based on like visual stuff versus like API stuff that you've done or database configuration stuff. But you'll see that change reflected immediately in the application.
Got it. Thank you. The next one is, can features be grouped or tagged and turned on or off as a set?
So short answer is no, not in the sense of, hey, I have this tag applied, production, and when I hit enable, it enables all production, but you can create prerequisites between flags. So you can say, this flag is only on if these flags are turned on. So you wouldn't do that by a tag. You would create a prerequisite relationship there, and you would turn off or turn on all of them, but the final flag would be the one that you have the prerequisites based on. So as long as that's off, all of these are registering as off. And once you turn that on, the prerequisite kicks in and says, okay, hey, this is on now, so I can actually push all of these changes out too. So prerequisite relationships are how you would do that. But it's a great question.
Awesome. This will be my last one, and hopefully you can answer it in like 30 seconds. But I think it's a good one. How do you avoid feature flag bloat, aka tech debt?
Yeah, intentionality. So keeping an eye on the flags that you're creating, making sure they're being removed when they're short-term flags. Using an infrastructure as code approach to manage flags inside the platform is a great way to approach it too. But really being intentional about removing features as they're being retired or as they're rolling out to production, and you're happy with them. Long-lived flags, those are always going to be around. You just want to be intentional about what's long-lived versus short-lived, and make it a point to clean up behind yourself as you finish up.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, this has been awesome. Thank you, Cody. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We'll pass it back to our moderator to close us off.
Well, Cody and Aaliyah, thank you both so much for joining us today. I'd like to quickly remind our audience that this session was recorded, so you should be receiving an email with a link to access the recording on demand. You can also find the recording living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and just be sure to look in the on-demand section. So on to our 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. Our first winner is Nick N. Our second winner is Sujoy S. Our third winner is Raymond H. And our fourth and final winner is Khaled H. So to the 4 of you, congratulations. Please keep an eye on your email to claim that gift card. But if you don't happen to see an email, check your spam folder. I'd like to thank AWS and LaunchDarkly for sponsoring today's webinar. And of course, before we close, I would love to thank our audience. We really appreciate you being here with us today. We ask for 1 extra moment of your time to fill out a brief post-webinar survey that should pop up on your screen here in just a moment. But otherwise, we do hope to see you at an upcoming Techstrong Learning workshop or webinar. Everyone, have a great rest of your day. And Cody, Aaliyah, thank you both so much one more time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.